Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and discovering that the world as you know it no longer exists, that everything you love, everyone you care about, every dream you've ever had, simply vanished in a blinding flash of light and heat. And now ask yourself this question. Have you ever wondered how close we actually came to that reality? How close humanity stood to the edge of absolute annihilation? Because I'm about to tell you about 13 days in October 1962 when the world balanced on a knife's edge between survival and nuclear holocaust. And here's what terrifies me most about this story. Most people today have no idea how close we came. They don't know that during those 13 days, the United States and the Soviet Union nearly unleashed enough nuclear weapons to end human civilization. We're talking about arsenals capable of destroying every major city on Earth multiple times over. And what keeps me awake at night is knowing that the only thing standing between us and oblivion was a handful of decisions made by exhausted, terrified men who were operating with incomplete information, making choices that would determine whether your grandparents would live to see another sunrise, whether your parents would ever be born, whether you would ever exist. And here's the part that almost nobody knows, the part that was buried in classified files for decades. There was someone else in that room, not physically, but his presence was everywhere. His intelligence, his sacrifice, his desperate gamble to save humanity from itself. And I need you to understand something right now. This isn't just another Cold War spy story. This is the story of how one man's courage prevented World War III, how his actions in the shadows of Moscow saved more lives than any general or president ever could. But here's the question that haunts historians like me. Why don't we know his name? Why isn't his face on currency? Why aren't there monuments built in his honor? And the answer to that question is more disturbing than you might imagine. Because after he saved the world, he vanished. Not into retirement, not into a comfortable life of recognition and gratitude, but into something far darker, far more mysterious. And I promise you, by the end of this story, you'll understand why this matters, why his sacrifice should never be forgotten, and why the truth about what happened to him is something that governments still don't want you to fully comprehend. So let me take you back to October 1962, to a moment when President John F. Kennedy received photographs that would change everything. Aerial reconnaissance images showing something in Cuba that made his blood run cold. Soviet nuclear missiles, dozens of them, being installed just 90 miles from American soil. Close enough to reach Washington, D.C. in minutes. Close enough to decapitate the entire American government before anyone could react. And suddenly, the Cold War wasn't cold anymore. It was burning hot, existentially hot. And what terrified Kennedy wasn't just the missiles themselves, it was the uncertainty. How many were there? How operational were they? What were the Soviets really planning? And here's where it gets absolutely chilling. Kennedy had to make a choice. He could launch a preemptive strike, bomb the missile sites before they became operational, which would almost certainly trigger a full-scale nuclear war with the Soviet Union, or he could negotiate, which meant showing weakness, which meant giving Khrushchev time to make those missiles fully operational. And both options led to potential catastrophe. Both paths could end in nuclear fire consuming the world. And the American military leadership was pushing hard for immediate military action. They wanted to strike first, strike hard, eliminate the threat before it was too late. But Kennedy hesitated. And do you want to know why he hesitated? Why he didn't give the order that his generals were demanding? It's because he had something they didn't have. He had intelligence, specific, detailed, technical intelligence about Soviet missile capabilities, about their readiness, about their actual threat level. And this intelligence didn't come from satellites, it didn't come from code breakers or electronic surveillance. It came from a human source, a man inside the Kremlin itself, someone who had access to the most closely guarded military secrets of the Soviet Union, someone who was risking everything to prevent the very war that both sides seemed determined to stumble into. And I need you to understand the stakes here, because we're not talking about a conventional war where armies clash and eventually someone surrenders. We're talking about nuclear weapons, thousands of them, each one exponentially more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And if you've ever seen the footage from those bombings, if you've ever heard the testimonies of the survivors describing skin melting off bodies, describing shadows of people burned permanently onto walls, describing rivers full of corpses and cities turned to ash in seconds, And you begin to grasp what was at stake during those 13 days. This wasn't political theater. This wasn't diplomatic posturing. This was humanity standing at the precipice of its own extinction. And the terrifying truth is that most of the people making decisions during the Cuban Missile Crisis didn't fully understand what they were dealing with. They had theories about nuclear war, they had strategic plans, they had war games and scenarios, but they didn't really know. They couldn't know because nothing like this had ever happened before. Humanity had never possessed the power to destroy itself so completely, so quickly, so irreversibly. And yet there they were, making decisions in real time under immense pressure with imperfect information. And every choice could be the one that ended everything. So when Kennedy sat in those emergency meetings with his advisors, when he listened to the hawks demanding immediate military action and the doves urging caution in negotiation, when he looked at those aerial photographs showing Soviet missiles in Cuba, he had one crucial advantage. He had intelligence from inside the Kremlin that told him the missiles weren't yet fully operational, that he had a window of time, narrow but real, to find a diplomatic solution. And that intelligence came at a price. The highest price imaginable, because the man who provided it knew exactly what would happen to him if he was discovered. He knew the KGB was always watching, always suspicious, always ready to arrest anyone who showed the slightest hint of disloyalty. And he provided that intelligence anyway. He photographed documents, he memorized technical specifications, he risked torture and execution because he believed that preventing nuclear war was worth any personal sacrifice. And I want you to think about that for a moment. Really think about it. Would you risk everything, your life, your family, your future, to save people you've never met, to prevent a catastrophe that might not even happen, to trust that your actions in the shadows might somehow, some way, make a difference in the decisions being made half a world away? Because that's exactly what this man did. And his intelligence didn't just inform Kennedy's decisions, it gave the president the confidence to resist his military advisors, to pursue negotiation instead of immediate military action, to bite time for diplomacy to work. And ultimately, after 13 days of the world holding its breath, after secret negotiations and public posturing, and moments when nuclear war seemed inevitable, the crisis was resolved. Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for American concessions, and humanity stepped back from the brink. And everyone breathed a sigh of relief. The world didn't end. Civilization continued. Life went on. And people forgot just how close we came to annihilation. But here's what they never knew. Here's what was classified for decades. Here's the secret that governments kept buried. The real hero of the Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't Kennedy or Khrushchev. It wasn't the diplomats or the generals. It was a Soviet intelligence officer named Oleg Penkovsky. And his story, his sacrifice, his mysterious fate, that's what I'm going to tell you about. Because he deserves to be remembered. He deserves to have his name spoken with reverence and gratitude. And the mystery of what really happened to him after he was discovered, that's something you need to hear. So stay with me because the story I'm about to unfold will change the way you think about heroism, about sacrifice, about the hidden history that shapes our world. And I promise you, by the end of this story, you'll understand why this matters, why his sacrifice should never be forgotten, and why the truth about what happened to him is something that governments still don't want you to fully comprehend. So let me take you back to October 1962. To a moment when President John F. Kennedy received photographs that would change everything. Aerial reconnaissance images showing something in Cuba that made his blood run cold. Soviet nuclear missiles, dozens of them, being installed just 90 miles from American soil. Close enough to reach Washington, D.C. in minutes. Close enough to decapitate the entire American government before anyone could react. And suddenly, the Cold War wasn't cold anymore. It was burning hot. Existentially hot. And what terrified Kennedy wasn't just the missiles themselves, it was the uncertainty. How many were there? How operational were they? What were the Soviets really planning? And here's where it gets absolutely chilling. Kennedy had to make a choice. He could launch a preemptive strike, bomb the missile sites before they became operational, which would almost certainly trigger a full-scale nuclear war with the Soviet Union,
Or he could negotiate, which meant showing weakness, which meant giving Khrushchev time to make those missiles fully operational. And both options led to potential catastrophe. Both paths could end in nuclear fire consuming the world. And the American military leadership was pushing hard for immediate military action. They wanted to strike first, strike hard, eliminate the threat before it was too late. But Kennedy hesitated. And do you want to know why he hesitated? Why he didn't give the order that his generals were demanding? It's because he had something they didn't have. He had intelligence, specific, detailed, technical intelligence about Soviet missile capabilities, about their readiness, about their actual threat level. And this intelligence didn't come from satellites. It didn't come from code breakers or electronic surveillance. It came from a human source, a man inside the Kremlin itself, someone who had access to the most closely guarded military secrets of the Soviet Union, someone who was...
Let me tell you about a man who should never have become a spy. A decorated Soviet military intelligence officer who had everything to lose and nothing to gain, except the satisfaction of knowing he might prevent the end of the world. And I want you to understand something crucial right from the start. Oleg Penkovsky wasn't some disillusioned communist who hated his country. He wasn't a mercenary looking for money. He wasn't compromised by blackmail or seduced by Western propaganda. He was something far more dangerous to the Soviet system. He was a true believer who stopped believing, a patriot who realized that loyalty to humanity was more important than loyalty to any government. And that's what makes his story so compelling and so tragic. Because when you strip away all the spycraft and the dead drops and the secret meetings, what you're left with is a simple question. What do you do when you know something terrible is going to happen and you're the only one who can stop it? And I think that's a question we all face at some point in our lives. Maybe not on the scale of nuclear war, but we all have moments when we have to choose between what's safe and what's right, between protecting ourselves and protecting others. And Oleg Penkovsky faced that choice in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. So who was this man? Where did it come from? What shaped him into someone willing to commit what his government would call the ultimate treason? And here's where the story gets interesting. Because Penkovsky wasn't born into poverty or oppression, he was born into privilege, relatively speaking. His father was a White Army officer who died during the Russian Civil War, which meant young Oleg grew up under a shadow of suspicion in Soviet society. The children of White Army officers were considered politically unreliable, tainted by their father's opposition to the Bolshevik Revolution. But Penkovsky was determined to overcome that stigma. He joined the Red Army. He fought in World War II. He earned medals and commendations. He proved his loyalty over and over again. And after the war, he rose through the ranks of Soviet military intelligence, the GRU. And by the late 1950s, he was a colonel with access to some of the Soviet Union's most sensitive military secrets. He attended classified briefings. He read intelligence reports that few people in the Soviet government ever saw. He knew about missile capabilities, nuclear warheads, strategic planning, delivery systems, everything the Americans desperately wanted to know but couldn't find out through technical means alone. And here's what I find so fascinating about Penkovsky. He didn't wake up one day and decide to betray his country. It was a gradual process, a slow realization that the system he served was deeply flawed, dangerously aggressive, willing to risk global catastrophe in pursuit of ideological dominance. And I think the turning point came when he started to understand the true nature of the nuclear arms race. When he saw the internal documents describing Soviet missile capabilities and strategic plans, when he realized that his government was lying to its own people about the risks they were taking, about how close they were willing to push humanity toward annihilation. And Penkovsky had a daughter. He had a family. He had people he loved who would die in a nuclear war just like everyone else. And I think that's when it became personal for him, when he realized that loyalty to the Soviet state meant potential death for everyone he cared about. And that's when he made his decision. Sometime in 1960, Oleg Penkovsky decided to contact Western intelligence, and you have to understand how monumentally difficult and dangerous this decision was. The KGB was everywhere in Soviet society. They had informants in every workplace, every apartment building, every social circle. They watched foreign embassies. They watched Soviet citizens who had contact with foreigners. They were paranoid and thorough and absolutely ruthless with anyone suspected of espionage. And Penkovsky knew all this. He knew exactly what would happen to him if he was caught. He'd seen what the KGB did to traitors, the interrogations, the torture, the show trials, the executions. And he decided to do it anyway. And his first attempts to make contact were almost comically unsuccessful. He approached American tourists in Moscow, trying to pass them notes, trying to establish contact, but the Americans were suspicious. They thought it might be a KGB provocation, a trap to embarrass the United States or compromise American intelligence officers. Because here's the thing about espionage during the Cold War. Both sides were so paranoid, so concerned about deception operations, that sometimes they couldn't recognize a genuine offer when it appeared. And Penkovsky kept trying. He was persistent, almost recklessly so. And finally, in 1961, during a trade delegation trip to London, he made successful contact with British intelligence, MI6, and through them with the CIA. And I want you to imagine that moment. Imagine being an intelligence officer and having a high-ranking GRU colonel walk into your life offering to provide the most sensitive Soviet military secrets. Your first instinct would be suspicion. You'd assume it was a trap. You'd think the KGB sent him to feed you disinformation or identify your intelligence officers. Because here's the thing about espionage during the Cold War. Both sides were so paranoid, so concerned about deception operations, that sometimes they couldn't recognize a genuine offer when it appeared. That Oleg Penkovsky was the real thing, a genuine source with access to exactly the kind of information that could change the balance of power in the Cold War. And what Penkovsky provided wasn't just valuable, it was unprecedented. He photographed thousands of pages of classified documents using a Minox camera, those tiny spy cameras you see in movies. And he didn't just photograph random papers. He was selective, strategic. He knew what the West needed to know. He provided technical manuals for Soviet missiles. He described their range, their accuracy, their payload capacity, their vulnerabilities. He provided information about Soviet military doctrine, about how they planned to use nuclear weapons in a conflict, about their command and control systems. And, perhaps most importantly, he provided information that revealed the truth about the so-called missile gap. You see, throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s, there was this widespread belief in the West that the Soviet Union had surpassed the United States in nuclear missile capabilities, that they had more missiles, better missiles, that they could strike first and cripple American defenses before the U.S. could respond. And this belief drove military spending, it drove policy decisions, it created genuine fear in Western populations. But Penkovsky's intelligence revealed that the missile gap was largely a myth, that the Soviets were actually behind the United States in missile technology, that they had fewer operational missiles than they claimed, that much of their nuclear posturing was bluff and intimidation. And this information was absolutely crucial during the Cuban Missile Crisis because it meant Kennedy could negotiate from a position of strength. He could call Khrushchev's bluff. He could resist the pressure from his military advisors who wanted immediate military action. And I want you to think about what motivated Penkovsky, because it wasn't money. The British and Americans offered to pay him, but he repeatedly refused significant payments. He accepted small amounts to avoid suspicion, to make the relationship seem normal, but he wasn't doing this for personal gain, and it wasn't ideology in the simple sense. He didn't become a capitalist or embrace Western democracy. He remained, in many ways, a Russian patriot. He loved his country. He loved Russian culture and history. What he hated was the Soviet system, the lies, the oppression, the willingness to risk human extinction for political advantage. And I think what really drove him was a sense of moral responsibility. He had access to information that could prevent nuclear war, and he believed that keeping that information secret, protecting it because of national loyalty, would make him complicit in whatever catastrophe followed. And that's a profound moral position. It's the idea that there are some things more important than national allegiance, that preventing mass death transcends political boundaries.
And in taking that position, Penkovsky was putting himself in extraordinary danger because the KGB was always watching, always suspicious, and they had specific reasons to watch Penkovsky. Remember, his father had been a White Army officer. That mark of political unreliability never fully disappeared. And Penkovsky had contact with foreigners through his official duties, which automatically made him a surveillance target. And the KGB was good at their job. They were patient, methodical. They watched for patterns, for anomalies, for anything that suggested disloyalty. And Penkovsky had to live a double life. He had to be a loyal Soviet officer by day, attending meetings, writing reports, socializing with colleagues, all while knowing that he was committing acts that his government would consider the highest treason. And he had to meet with his Western handlers, pass them documents, receive instructions, all while avoiding KGB surveillance. And the methods they used were straight out of spy novels. Dead drops, where Penkovsky would hide film canisters of photographed documents in prearranged locations. Brush passes, where intelligence officers would briefly make physical contact in crowds to exchange materials. Coded messages hidden in apparently innocent letters. And there were close calls, moments when KGB surveillance came dangerously close to catching him, times when Penkovsky had to abort a meeting because he detected surveillance, times when the tension must have been absolutely unbearable. And I think about the psychological toll this must have taken, the constant fear, the knowledge that discovery meant not just his own death but potentially terrible consequences for his family. The isolation of knowing he could never tell anyone what he was really doing, never seek support or reassurance. And yet he continued. For approximately 18 months, from April 1961 through October 1962, Oleg Penkovsky provided the West with some of the most valuable intelligence in Cold War history. And during that time, he must have known that it couldn't last forever, that eventually the KGB would catch him, that his time was running out. And I wonder if he knew, during those final months, during the Cuban Missile Crisis itself, if he understood that the intelligence he'd provided was being used at the highest levels of American government, if he knew that his sacrifice was actually making a difference, actually preventing the war he feared, or if he operated in complete darkness, hoping his efforts mattered but never knowing for sure. And that uncertainty, that faith that his actions had meaning even without confirmation, that might be the most heroic part of his entire story. Because he wasn't seeking glory or recognition, he was seeking survival for humanity, and he was willing to pay any personal price to achieve it. And the price he would pay, the fate that awaited him after his arrest, that's something that still haunts historians today, something that raises questions about justice, about sacrifice, about whether one man's courage can truly change history. And I promise you, what happened to Oleg Penkovsky after the KGB finally caught him is not what you'd expect. It's darker and stranger and more mysterious than any conventional spy story. But before we get to that, before we talk about his arrest and trial and the questions surrounding his fate, I need you to understand something fundamental. Oleg Penkovsky wasn't a traitor, at least not in any meaningful moral sense. He was someone who chose humanity over nationality, who chose truth over loyalty, who chose the lives of millions of people he would never meet over his own safety and comfort. And that's not betrayal. That's the highest form of courage. And his story matters not just as history, but as a reminder that individual actions can have enormous consequences, that one person with access to the truth and the courage to share it can literally save the world. And that's why his name should be remembered, why his sacrifice should be honored, why the mystery of his fate should trouble us. Because Oleg Penkovsky did something extraordinary, and then he vanished. And what really happened to the spy who saved the world, that's the question that will haunt you long after this story ends.
Now let me tell you about the intelligence itself, the actual information that Oleg Penkovsky risked everything to deliver. Because this wasn't abstract data or theoretical analysis. This was concrete, actionable intelligence that fundamentally changed how the United States understood Soviet military capabilities and ultimately gave President Kennedy the confidence to navigate the most dangerous crisis in human history without triggering nuclear war. And I need you to understand something that most people don't grasp about intelligence work. It's not like the movies where a spy steals one document that changes everything. Real intelligence is about accumulation. It's about building a comprehensive picture from thousands of small pieces of information, cross-referencing data, verifying claims, understanding context. And that's exactly what Penkovsky provided. Not a single smoking gun, but rather a detailed, meticulously documented portrait of Soviet military capabilities that transformed Western understanding of the nuclear balance of power. And the way he did this was extraordinary. Remember, Penkovsky was a GRU colonel with legitimate access to classified information. He attended briefings at the highest levels of Soviet military intelligence. He had clearance to read documents that revealed the most sensitive details of Soviet missile programs, nuclear warhead specifications, delivery systems, strategic planning. And he systematically photographed these documents using a Minox camera, that iconic spy camera that was small enough to conceal easily, but sophisticated enough to capture clear images of text and technical diagrams. And he didn't just photograph randomly, he was strategic. He understood what the West needed to know, what gaps existed in their intelligence, what questions they were asking but couldn't answer. And I think this is what made him such an invaluable source. He wasn't just a passive provider of whatever he happened to see. He was an active intelligence officer himself, using his training and expertise to identify the most crucial information and prioritize its delivery. And the volume of material he provided was staggering. Over the 18 months of his active espionage, Penkovsky photographed more than 5,000 pages of classified Soviet documents. He provided technical manuals, operational procedures, strategic assessments, targeting data, readiness reports, everything the CIA and MI6 needed to understand, not just what the Soviets had, but how they planned to use it. And let me tell you about some of the specific intelligence that changed everything. First, and most importantly, Penkovsky provided detailed technical specifications for Soviet missile systems, particularly the R-12 medium-range ballistic missile, which NATO called the SS-4. And this wasn't just general information. This was engineering-level detail. Range capabilities, fuel requirements, launch preparation times, accuracy parameters, warhead yields. And why did this matter so much? Because when American U-2 spy planes photographed those mysterious installations in Cuba in October 1962, when analysts looked at the images and saw construction that might be missile sites, they needed to know exactly what they were looking at. And Penkovsky's intelligence allowed them to identify the missile types with absolute certainty. They could look at the dimensions of the launch pads, the configuration of support equipment, the layout of fuel storage facilities, and say definitively, these are SS-4 missiles. These are the specifications. This is their range. This is how long it takes to make them operational. And that certainty was crucial, because without it, Kennedy would have been making decisions based on assumptions and estimates. He would have been operating in a fog of uncertainty, not knowing if the missiles could reach Washington, D.C. or just Florida, not knowing if they were already operational or still under construction, not knowing if he had days or hours to respond. But because of Penkovsky's intelligence, Kennedy knew. He knew exactly what type of missiles were in Cuba, he knew their capabilities, he knew their limitations, and perhaps most importantly, he knew how long it would take the Soviets to make them fully operational. And this knowledge created a window of opportunity for diplomacy, because the intelligence showed that the missiles weren't yet ready to launch, that the Soviets were still in the installation phase, that Kennedy had time. Not much time, but enough to pursue negotiation before resorting to military action. And I want you to imagine being in the Situation Room during those 13 days in October 1962. Imagine being Kennedy, looking at aerial photographs of missile sites in Cuba, listening to your military advisors telling you that immediate airstrikes are the only option, that you need to destroy these sites before they become operational, that delay means risk, that hesitation could cost American lives. And then,
Imagine having intelligence that tells you precisely how much time you actually have, that gives you confidence to resist the pressure for immediate military action, that allows you to pursue diplomatic channels because you know the missiles aren't yet ready to launch. And that's exactly what Penkovsky's intelligence provided. It gave Kennedy the confidence to negotiate. And there's more. Penkovsky also provided crucial information about the broader Soviet missile program. And this intelligence revealed something that shocked Western analysts. The so-called missile gap was largely fictional. Throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s, there was widespread belief in the West that the Soviet Union had achieved superiority in intercontinental ballistic missiles, that they had more ICBMs than the United States, that they could launch a devastating first strike that would cripple American defenses. And this belief drove policy, it drove military spending, it created genuine panic in some circles. Politicians campaigned on closing the missile gap. Military planners developed strategies based on the assumption of Soviet superiority. And Penkovsky's intelligence revealed that it was all based on Soviet deception and Western overestimation. The Soviets didn't have hundreds of operational ICBMs, they had dozens. Their missile technology was less advanced than Soviet propaganda claimed. Their missiles were less accurate, less reliable, more vulnerable to technical failures. And this information fundamentally altered the strategic calculation, because it meant the United States was actually ahead in the nuclear arms race, that American military strength was greater than many believed, that Soviet nuclear threats were often bluffs designed to compensate for actual weakness. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, this knowledge was crucial because it meant Kennedy could negotiate from a position of strength. He could make demands, he could insist on missile removal, he could threaten consequences, all while knowing that the strategic balance favored the United States. And Penkovsky provided something else that was equally valuable. He provided insight into Soviet military doctrine and decision-making processes. He described how Soviet commanders thought about nuclear weapons, how they planned to use them in a conflict, what their protocols were for launch authorization, what their command and control systems looked like. And this information helped Western analysts understand Soviet behavior, predict their responses, identify opportunities for negotiation. And I think this is often overlooked in discussions of intelligence. We focus on the technical data, the missile specifications and warhead yields, but understanding how your adversary thinks, how they make decisions, what their fears and motivations are, that's often more valuable than knowing what weapons they possess. And Penkovsky provided both. He gave the West a window into the Soviet military mind. And he did all of this while living under constant surveillance, while maintaining his cover as a loyal Soviet officer, while knowing that every photograph he took, every document he copied, every meeting he attended with his Western handlers could be the action that exposed him. And the operational security required was extraordinary.
Penkovsky couldn't just walk into the American embassy and hand over documents. The embassy was watched constantly. Every Soviet citizen who entered was noted, followed, investigated, so the intelligence services developed elaborate systems for document transfer. Dead drops were a primary method. Penkovsky would photograph documents at home or in his office, hide the film canisters, then deposit them at prearranged locations in Moscow, behind loose bricks in walls, inside hollow trees in parks, under park benches. And Western intelligence officers, operating under diplomatic cover, would retrieve these materials. And the timing had to be perfect. The location had to be secure. Any deviation from normal patterns could attract KGB attention. And there were brush passes, brief moments of contact in crowds where materials would be exchanged without any obvious interaction. Penkovsky might walk past a Western diplomat on a busy Moscow street, and in that fraction of a second, a package would change hands. And casual observers, even trained surveillance teams, might miss it entirely. And there were meetings, carefully orchestrated encounters where Penkovsky could provide verbal briefings, answer questions, receive instructions. And these meetings were incredibly dangerous. They required counter-surveillance, careful route planning, secure locations, and even then, the risk of discovery was immense. And Penkovsky also received equipment and training from his handlers. They gave him better cameras, taught him photography techniques, provided him with concealment devices, showed him how to detect surveillance, how to communicate through coded messages, how to protect himself. And I think about the psychological burden of this work. Imagine having access to information that could prevent nuclear war, knowing that getting this information to the right people could save millions of lives, but also knowing that every action you take increases the risk of discovery, that the KGB is always watching, always investigating, always one step away from catching you. And you can't tell anyone. You can't seek support or reassurance. You have to live this double life completely alone, maintaining the facade of loyal Soviet officer while committing what your government considers the ultimate betrayal. And the paranoia must have been overwhelming. Every unexpected phone call could be the KGB. Every knock on the door could be arrest. Every colleague who looked at you strangely could be an informant. Every surveillance team you noticed could be the one that finally has enough evidence to take you down. And yet Penkovsky continued, month after month, photographing documents, attending meetings, providing intelligence because he believed it mattered. Because he believed that preventing nuclear war was worth any personal sacrifice. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis itself, Penkovsky's intelligence was being used at the highest levels of American government. Kennedy and his advisors were reading assessments based directly on information Penkovsky had provided. They were looking at technical specifications he had photographed. They were making decisions about war and peace based on his courage. And I wonder if Penkovsky knew this, if he understood that his intelligence was being used in real time to navigate the crisis, or if he was operating in darkness, hoping his efforts mattered but never receiving confirmation. And there's something profoundly moving about that uncertainty, about continuing to risk everything without knowing if it makes any difference, without receiving recognition or gratitude, just faith that truth matters, that information can save lives, that one person's courage can change history. And the intelligence Penkovsky provided did change history. There's no question about that. Multiple historians and intelligence officials have stated unequivocally that Penkovsky's intelligence was crucial to the peaceful resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis, that without his information, Kennedy would have been operating blind, making decisions based on incomplete data and worst-case assumptions. But because of Penkovsky, Kennedy had clarity. He had confidence. He had the knowledge necessary to negotiate rather than attack, to pursue diplomacy rather than immediate military action. And that choice, that decision to negotiate, saved the world, prevented nuclear war, allowed humanity to step back from the brink of annihilation, and it happened because one Soviet intelligence officer decided that humanity was more important than nationality, that preventing catastrophe was more important than personal safety, that truth was more important than loyalty to a political system he no longer believed in. And I think that's the real significance of Penkovsky's intelligence, not just the technical specifications and missile data, but what it represents about individual moral courage, about the power of truth in a world built on secrets and lies, about the possibility that one person, in the right place at the right time, with access to crucial information and the courage to share it, can literally save millions of lives. And that's not hyperbole. That's not exaggeration. That's historical fact. Oleg Penkovsky's intelligence prevented nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And everything that came after, every person born since October 1962, every achievement of human civilization over the past 6 decades, all of it exists because one man was willing to risk everything to provide the information that allowed rational decision-making during humanity's most dangerous crisis. And yet, most people don't know his name. Most people have never heard his story. And that's tragic, because heroism like this, sacrifice like this, deserves recognition. Sacrifice like this deserves remembrance. And the questions surrounding what happened to him after his arrest, those questions should trouble us, should make us think about justice and gratitude, and how history remembers or forgets the people who save us from ourselves. And that's what we need to talk about now. Because in October 1962, just as the Cuban Missile Crisis was reaching its climax, just as Penkovsky's intelligence was being used to navigate humanity through its most dangerous moment, the KGB was closing in on him. They had been investigating for months, gathering evidence, building a case, and the trap was about to spring shut. And what happened next, the arrest, the interrogation, the trial, and the mystery surrounding his ultimate fate, that's where this story becomes darker, stranger, and more troubling than anything we've discussed so far. The arrest came in October 1962, right in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, at the exact moment when Penkovsky's intelligence was being used at the highest levels of American government to prevent nuclear war. And I want you to think about the terrible irony of that timing. While Kennedy and Khrushchev were locked in their deadly confrontation over Cuba, while the world held its breath waiting to see if humanity would survive, the man whose intelligence had made peaceful resolution possible was being dragged from his Moscow apartment by KGB officers. And everything he had worked for, everything he had risked, was about to be tested in the cruelest possible way. Because the KGB didn't just want to arrest Penkovsky, they wanted to break him. They wanted to extract every detail of his espionage activities, identify his contacts, understand his methods, and most importantly, they wanted to use him as an example, a warning to anyone else who might consider betraying the Soviet state. And I need you to understand what KGB interrogation meant in 1962. We're not talking about polite questioning, we're talking about systematic psychological and physical torture designed to destroy a person's will, to make them confess to anything, to turn them into compliant puppets who would say whatever their interrogators wanted in public trial. And Penkovsky knew this was coming. He had known from the moment he started spying that if he was caught, this would be his fate. And yet he had done it anyway. And I think about those first moments of his arrest. Imagine being woken in the middle of the night by pounding on your door, knowing immediately what it means, knowing that everything you feared is now happening, that there's no escape, no last-minute rescue, no miracle that will save you. And imagine looking at your family, your daughter, knowing this is probably the last time you'll see them, knowing that your actions have brought consequences not just on yourself, but on everyone you love. Because the Soviet system was vindictive. They punished families of traitors, stripped them of privileges, made them outcasts. And Penkovsky had to face that reality as KGB officers handcuffed him and took him away. And the interrogation that followed was brutal. The KGB wanted to know everything. Who had he contacted? What information had he provided? How had he communicated with Western intelligence? What techniques had he used? Who else was involved? And they had time. They had complete control. Penkovsky was in Lubyanka prison, the KGB headquarters in Moscow, a place where people disappeared, where screams echoed through corridors, where interrogators worked in shifts to keep prisoners disoriented and exhausted, and the techniques they used were sophisticated. They alternated between violence and kindness, between threats and promises. They deprived him of sleep, subjected him to constant interrogation, played psychological games designed to break his resistance. And I wonder what went through Penkovsky's mind during those sessions. Did he think about the intelligence he had provided, about the Cuban Missile Crisis playing out while he sat in a prison cell? Did he know that his sacrifice had mattered, that Kennedy had used his information to navigate the crisis, that nuclear war had been prevented? Or was he completely cut off from news, operating in darkness, wondering if everything he had done had made any difference at all? And the KGB eventually extracted a confession. They always did. They had methods that could break almost anyone. And in May 1963, Oleg Penkovsky was put on trial.
a show trial designed to demonstrate Soviet justice and warn potential traitors. And show trials in the Soviet Union were theatrical productions. The outcome was predetermined. The defendant's role was to confess publicly, to admit guilt, to validate the state's accusations, and Penkovsky played his part. He confessed to espionage, acknowledged his crimes, accepted responsibility, and the trial was widely publicized. Soviet media covered it extensively. They wanted everyone to see what happened to traitors, what awaited anyone who betrayed the motherland. And the verdict was never in doubt. Oleg Penkovsky was found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. And according to official Soviet records, he was executed by firing squad shortly after the trial concluded. And that should be the end of the story. The tragic but straightforward conclusion: spy gets caught, spy gets executed, case closed. Except here's where things get strange. Here's where the official narrative starts to fall apart. Because there are questions, troubling questions, about what really happened to Oleg Penkovsky. And these questions have haunted intelligence historians for decades. First, there are the unusual aspects of the trial itself. Some observers noted that Penkovsky seemed heavily medicated during proceedings, that his responses seemed rehearsed, that he didn't behave like someone facing imminent execution. And there were rumors, never confirmed, that the KGB had broken him so thoroughly that he was essentially a shell, a broken man reading from a script. And then there's the execution. According to official records, Penkovsky was shot. But the details are vague. There were no photographs, no independent witnesses, just official statements from Soviet authorities. And given the Soviet government's track record of deception, given their willingness to fabricate evidence and manipulate information, some intelligence analysts began to wonder, was Penkovsky really executed, or was something else going on? And I need to tell you about the alternative theories, because they're fascinating and disturbing in equal measure. Some intelligence sources suggested that Penkovsky might have been kept alive, that the execution was staged, that the KGB wanted the world to think he was dead, while they continued interrogating him, extracting every last piece of information. And why would they do this? Because dead spies can't provide intelligence. But living spies, properly motivated, properly broken, can be gold mines of information. They can reveal operational details, identify intelligence officers, expose techniques and procedures. And the KGB was patient. They could spend years extracting information if they believed the source was valuable enough. And Penkovsky was extraordinarily valuable.
He had worked with both MI6 and CIA. He knew their methods, their personnel, their operational procedures. He had information that could compromise Western intelligence operations for years. So maybe, some analysts suggested, maybe the Soviets faked his execution and kept him alive in some secret facility, interrogating him endlessly. And there's another theory, even more controversial, that Penkovsky might have been part of a prisoner exchange, that sometime after his trial, perhaps years later, he might have been secretly traded to the West in exchange for Soviet agents captured by Western intelligence. And this theory is based on the fact that prisoner exchanges were common during the Cold War. Both sides captured each other's spies, and both sides were willing to trade them. And if the Soviets had kept Penkovsky alive, if they had extracted everything they could from him, they might eventually have decided he was more valuable as a bargaining chip than as a permanent prisoner. And according to this theory, Penkovsky might have spent his final years living quietly somewhere in the West, under a new identity, never able to reveal who he really was or what he had done, living in permanent exile and anonymity. And I find this theory both hopeful and heartbreaking. Hopeful because it means Penkovsky might have survived, might have escaped the execution he seemed destined for. But heartbreaking because it means he lived the rest of his life cut off from his family, from his country, from any recognition or gratitude for what he had done, unable to ever tell his story or receive acknowledgement for saving the world. And then there's the darkest theory, whispered in intelligence circles but never proven, that Penkovsky's execution wasn't a simple firing squad, that the KGB, in their vindictiveness, in their desire to make an example, did something far worse. There are rumors, unconfirmed and perhaps unconfirmable, that Penkovsky was cremated alive, burned to death as punishment for his betrayal. And this rumor comes from alleged KGB sources, defectors who claim to have heard about special punishments for particularly hated traitors. And I have no way to verify this. There's no documentary evidence, no reliable confirmation.
But the rumor persists, and it speaks to the depth of hatred the Soviet security services felt toward anyone who betrayed them. And the truth is, we may never know exactly what happened to Oleg Penkovsky. The Soviet archives that might contain definitive answers remain classified or have been destroyed. The witnesses are dead or silent. The intelligence agencies that worked with him maintain official secrecy about sources and methods. And so Penkovsky exists in this strange historical limbo. We know what he did, we know the intelligence he provided, we know he was arrested and tried, but we don't know with certainty how his story ended. And I think there's something appropriate about that uncertainty, something that captures the essential loneliness and sacrifice of his actions. Because Penkovsky didn't do what he did for recognition or reward. He did it because he believed it was right, because he believed preventing nuclear war was worth any personal cost. And whether he died in 1963 or lived for years afterward in secret exile, whether his death was quick or agonizing, whether he ever knew that his intelligence had been used to prevent the catastrophe he feared, none of that changes the fundamental reality of what he accomplished. Oleg Penkovsky saved the world. That's not hyperbole. That's not poetic exaggeration. That's documented historical fact. His intelligence gave Kennedy the information necessary to navigate the Cuban Missile Crisis without triggering nuclear war. And every person alive today, every child born since 1962, every achievement of human civilization over the past 6 decades, all of it exists because one man was willing to risk everything to provide the truth that allowed rational decision-making during humanity's most dangerous moment. And yet his name is largely forgotten. Most people have never heard of Oleg Penkovsky. There are no monuments to him, no holidays celebrating his sacrifice, no widespread recognition of what he did. And I think that's a tragedy, because heroism like this deserves remembrance, sacrifice like this deserves honor, and the questions surrounding his fate should trouble us, should make us think about what we owe to people who save us from ourselves. And I wonder sometimes what Penkovsky would think if he could see the world today. If he could see that humanity survived, that the Cold War ended without nuclear catastrophe, that the world he saved went on to achieve things he could never have imagined. Would it bring him comfort? Would it justify his sacrifice? Would it make the suffering worthwhile? And I think about the broader lessons of his story, about individual moral courage in the face of institutional power, about the importance of truth in a world built on secrets and lies, about the power of one person to change history when they have access to crucial information and the courage to act on their convictions. And I think about the people today who face similar choices, maybe not on the scale of nuclear war, but moments when they have to decide between loyalty to institutions and loyalty to truth, between personal safety and moral responsibility, between what's easy and what's right. And Penkovsky's story is a reminder that those choices matter, that individual actions have consequences, that courage in the face of overwhelming odds is possible and necessary. And his story is also a warning about the cost of that courage, about the price paid by people who choose truth over loyalty, about how systems protect themselves by destroying those who challenge them, about how heroes are often forgotten or erased by the very societies they save. And I think that's why the mystery of Penkovsky's fate matters, because it represents something larger than one man's death. It represents how history remembers or forgets, how societies honor or ignore the people who save them, how truth gets buried or preserved. And the fact that we don't know exactly what happened to him, the fact that his final days remain shrouded in uncertainty and rumor, that itself is part of the story, part of the tragedy, because he deserved better. He deserved to be remembered, to be honored, to have his name spoken with gratitude by the millions of people who owe their existence to his courage. And maybe that's what we can do now. Tell his story, remember his name, acknowledge what he did. Because Oleg Penkovsky was the spy who saved the world. And then he vanished, disappeared into the darkness of Soviet prisons or the anonymity of secret exile or the finality of execution, and we may never know the complete truth of his fate. But we know enough. We know he was brave. We know he was selfless. We know he chose humanity over nationality, truth over loyalty, the lives of millions over his own safety. And that's heroism in its purest form. That's sacrifice worthy of remembrance. And if you take nothing else from this story, take this. Remember Oleg Penkovsky. Remember that one person with courage and access to truth can change the course of history. Remember that preventing catastrophe often requires people willing to risk everything without guarantee of success or recognition. And remember that the world you live in, the life you're able to live, might exist because of sacrifices you'll never know about, made by people whose names you've never heard. And Oleg Penkovsky is one of those people, a name that should be known, a story that should be told, a sacrifice that should never be forgotten. Because he saved the world, and then he vanished forever. And that's the story, that's the truth, that's the legacy of the spy who saved nuclear war and paid the ultimate price for his courage. And now you know, now you understand, now you carry this knowledge forward. And maybe that's all we can do for people like Penkovsky. Remember them, tell their stories, ensure that their sacrifices aren't lost to history, that their courage inspires future generations, that their names live on even when everything else about them has vanished into darkness. And Oleg Penkovsky deserves that remembrance, deserves that honor, deserves to be recognized for what he was, a hero who saved humanity from itself and then disappeared into the shadows of history, leaving behind only questions, mysteries, and the undeniable fact that without him, the world as we know it might not exist at all.